Let's say that you were walking along a beach one day, and as you are walking along the beach, you look down, and there, half buried in the sand, you see a pocket watch. And let's say that you pick up that pocket watch and you begin to try and determine how it got there, where it came from, what is the origin of the pocket watch. And if you turn the pocket watch over, you might see the insides of it. If you took off the back, see the insides and all the gears and all the mechanizations in there that turn the hands of the watch in order to keep time. Now let's say that even after you see all this, all these different mechanizations and the intricate design of the watch, then you said, I know how it got here. It's by accident. It just was created on the beach here by the waves and by the sand. It just happened to evolve here. Now, wouldn't you think that that would be just a little bit crazy for someone to come up with an idea that all these different gears and that could just evolve over time, even if they had millions or billions of years? Wouldn't you think that would be just impossible for it to be able to come up with something this intricate and this designed? And yet, there are those out there who say that the human body, that humans have come about by changes over millions of years in other species. Now, a few weeks ago actually, on April the 1st, I stood before you and we talked about it being National Atheist Day. We talked a little bit about Darwin and the theories of Darwin and how they just don't fit in with what the Bible says. And as I was doing that, it became clear to me that we could do a lot more lessons than just talking about Darwin in being able to go to others and prove God. Maybe everybody that's here this evening already believes in God. But maybe we need a refresher course, or maybe we need some more learning, knowledge that we can add to our own minds to be able to go out and to tell other people about this and be able to prove God to someone else. 100 years ago, it was almost impossible to come upon someone who said that they were an atheist, at least in this country. It's just everybody believed that God was. Now, there were a lot of different doctrinal arguments. There are a lot of arguments over who God was and how God works and how we worship God. But the arguments over origin were not the same as they are today. As we go further and further into time, it seems that more and more people are now coming out saying they don't believe that there is a God. In fact, what they want to believe is in what they call reason. Remember, I told you when we talked about Darwin that they had a big gathering over the weekend of these people, and they called it the Reason Rally. Some said there were 3,000, some said there were 30,000. There were different reports of how many people were in Washington, D.C. for this Reason Rally. And the whole idea was to say that God doesn't exist. That we don't believe in God, we believe rather in reason. So I asked the question, is it reasonable to believe in God? Since the Reason Rally we had a few weeks ago, something that started back quite a few decades ago called the National Day of Prayer. And on the National Day of Prayer, there is a congressman who is the only avowed atheist congressman in all of the U.S. Congress. And he declared that it was not the National Day of Prayer, that rather it was the National Day of Reason. So you see the idea here that they are going with, the idea to try and say that it's not reasonable to believe in God. Either you believe in God or you believe in reason. And you see how they set the two opposing one another. But in fact, they don't oppose one another. it is reasonable to believe that something that is as intricate as our bodies, that something that we have this much evidence for, is true. That if we have design, there must be a designer. Now we can look at pages of the Bible and see some of what is written there. In Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27, it says, "So God created the man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." Now we could go to Psalm chapter 139 and verse 14, and there the psalmist declares, "I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well." Or we could go to Romans chapter 1 and verse 20. A lot of times we go to Romans chapter 1, we're going there to say something about homosexuality. We forget about everything else that's there in Romans chapter 1. But there's a lot of other meat there just in saying that homosexuality is wrong, is sinful. And one thing that it says is, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, and the things that have been made, so they," that being people who don't believe in God, "so they are without excuse." It says that people could have looked at the world that was around them, seen the intricate design that is within nature, and by seeing that know that there is a designer, that there is a supreme being who has made all that. So anyone who denies that is without excuse. You can look at the fact that Jesus believed what was written in Genesis. Some people say, well, okay, God could have started it, but he could have done it in a way that evolutionists say. He could have just started the ball rolling and then, taken millions of years for everything to go from that one first amoeba, that primordial soup, as they call it. And maybe that's the way that God did it. But that's not what the book of Genesis says. And if you're going to say that you believe in Jesus, then you're going to have to say that you believe in the things that Jesus taught. You look at Jesus talking about marriage, it says in the beginning, God created the male and female. He's referring back to this verse here in Genesis chapter 1. Jesus believed the words that were in Genesis because he knew they were true, being God himself. So if we're going to believe in Jesus, then we also must believe in creation. This is a drawing of a cell. It's what we know about the cell so far. Some of us that are older may remember having been in school. We drew cell diagrams in science classes, and it didn't have nearly this many blanks for us to fill in. So as science goes further, they're able to discover more and more powerful microscopes. We don't know yet what's in the nucleus or in the nucleolus of the cell. Maybe someday we will. And it just gets more and more intricate as time goes on. So can we believe that this just evolved, all of this? There are tiny machines within our bodies that are constantly building new cells. And each cell that is built has all of these parts within it. Is that something that could have just evolved over time? This is the circulatory system of the human body. They perceive that if you took all of the blood vessels out of an average human body and you placed them in a single line, you would have a line extending 60,000 miles. That's enough to wrap around the earth nearly 3 times. So imagine all of those blood vessels in one human body. This is the human nerve system. We took all the nerves, the main nerves, out of the body and were to string them into a single line. It would be about 45 miles long. Now that's just the main nerves that are in the body. That doesn't even count all the little neurons. If we talked about the neurons that are in our brains, there's over 100 billion, I believe it is. Over 100 billion neurons in the human brain. All these things firing in the synapses, but it just happened by accident, is what science would like us to believe, what certain scientists would like us to believe. And the human skeletal system. All the bones knit together as God created them. A great engineer. So that we had opposing thumbs. We might be able to open up jars. You know, the human hand, we cannot create a machine that can do what the human hand can do. Never yet has an engineer been able to create something that works as the human hand does. Same thing with a lot of the other limbs that are in our bodies and our eyes. Richard Dawkins, famous atheist in the UK, came out with a book that was called The Blind Watchmaker, making fun of the pocket watch idea, illustration. And he said that the eye is a bad design, that God is actually a bad engineer. Along with him, another famous scientist who, you can see what I think of him, I've forgotten his name. He came out with a book, The Panda's Thumb, and said that the panda's thumb is an example of bad engineering. That if there were truly a designer, that he must not be perfect, because he would not have designed the human eye or the panda's thumb the way that they have been designed. Since then, it has been discovered that the panda's thumb is built in a perfect way for it to be able to go over and over stripping bamboo. The human thumb wouldn't be able to do that. But the panda's thumb is created specifically for that job. The human eye, the reason we have an inverted lens, that's what Richard Dawkins was saying was bad engineering. The reason we have an inverted lens in our eye is because it makes circulation easier, so that the blood can go down to the cones and the rods which are in your eye, and it can be supplied more easily, so that the light can be filtered down, and we can perceive images more clearly than we would be able to otherwise. You see, a lot of times what is seen as bad engineering is just answering the wrong question. They just didn't understand what it was built for, why it was built that way. A lot of times you bring an engineer in, he looks at something, he says, oh, I would do it differently. And maybe he would, but maybe he's not answering the right problem. He doesn't understand what it is that the machine was being designed for. But God knew what he was doing when he designed every machine that exists, every living machine. Evolutionists have their diagrams too. You've probably seen this one before, where we have the so-called common ancestor of man here and apes. And it gets a little bit more like a man with each drawing there. And you know what evidence they have for this? None. Speculation. Just an idea that somebody had and they decided to draw it. And then other scientists thought, oh, this is a good idea. So they caught on and they started to draw it too. And now this is taught. I know this is taught because I was taught it back when I was in 4th grade. Not only was I taught this, you ever hear of Haeckel before? Haeckel was the name of a scientist who had taken and drawn what he believed the human fetus looked like as it was growing in the womb. And he had this series of drawings. I wanted to get a slide of it and I forgot to do so. You can look it up online though. Probably find it very easy. He thought that it looked like different animals, that the fetus would look like a different animal at each stage and even have a tail. When I was probably in about 2nd or 3rd grade, I remember being homesick from school, and I was watching public television. And they had this woman on there talking about the human fetus, and she was talking about how it had a tail. They were still teaching that, even in the 1970s, teaching Haeckel's idea. It had long since been disproved. He had admitted that he was a fraud, that he had just drawn these from his own imagination. And we know today, of course, from all of the equipment that is out there, what a human fetus looks like. Looks like a human. Looks like a baby, not like an animal at different stages. And it doesn't have a tail. But this was the idea that was put out there. You know some of the other things that have been put out there? Anybody know who this is? Java Man. Java Man, all we have of Java Man is a skull cap. And from that, they've built the rest of this here skull. They know what the jawbone looks like, apparently, what the nasal cavity looked like, what the eye sockets looked like, and then they came up with this from that skull which they built. Yeah, all they had was a skull cap. The top, very top, that dark part right there. And they built the rest of the skull from their own ideas about what it would look like. He's not the only one. This is, let me see if I can pronounce that. Australopithecus. I don't know how scientists say these things. They say he's from 3 to 4 million years ago, and they found this skull in Africa. What they found was that bone, and that bone. What they built was the whole rest of this skull, just from ideas in their own minds about what it would look like. My friend and I went to the Museum of Natural History in New York City. And they have what's called the Hall of Time, I believe, there. And of course, it's all about evolution and how man grew from one thing to another. And interestingly enough, in that line, they have Neanderthal, which I believe was at least 5 years ago, said that he wasn't part of man's line anyways. But they've got him there. They've got Lucy there, and they've got a few other types of skeletons that have been found, or at least casts of the bones. They had a whole row of skulls. And my friend and I went over to look at these skulls. And he said, now how is it that they would know that that skull would look like that? Because there was one skull there, and the part that they had built had this forehead that came out like this. I don't know, it looked like some sort of alien creature. And that was all built from clay. There wasn't anything to suggest that that would really be there, except somebody had surmised that it should be there. And so they built it that way. And that goes on all the time in the scientific community. The ideas, and then building it, and then passing it off as this is fact. It's not fact. It's somebody's guess at what is the truth. And it's not even close to what the truth actually is. I mentioned Lucy a couple of minutes ago. Would you like to see a picture of what Lucy would have looked like? There you go. That's Lucy. Pygmy chimp. Nothing, fascinating. Nothing that would look like, they think that's your ancestor. You think that's our ancestor? Maybe you came from this, I didn't. The hip bone, you can see how they've got some displays there. This is in the Creation Museum in close to Louisville, Kentucky. And they've got the hip bone there that was found, Lucy's hip bone. They show how it would have fit into a pygmy chimp. They show the skull pieces there. There's also some rib cage pieces. But what it comes down to is that Lucy was a pygmy chimp, maybe with some arthritis. But this is what it comes down to. You asked about the age of the earth, or the age of some fossils that have been found. They say that a fossil is the age it is because of the rock layer that it was found in. It's found in this layer of the earth, and we know that this layer of the earth is 200 million years old. So then you ask, well, how do you know how old the rock layer is? Well, we know the rock layer is 200 million years old because of the fossils that were found in it. You know, no dating goes on anymore, scientific dating. Carbon-14, make a big deal out of that. They don't do it anymore. Now they just find a fossil, and because of the rock layer it was found in, or because of what it looks like, they say, oh, it must be this many years old. And everybody just goes along with that. They don't test it to see how old it might be. They've come out with a lot of different ideas about how to test for the age of fossils. Phosphorus dating, radiocarbon, of course, was the first one, carbon-14. Now they've got all sorts of other ideas, and none of them are accurate. They've all been shown to be inaccurate. They took a cow bone from a cow that died 50 years ago. They sent it in. They said they found it. They lied about where they found it and how they found it. And they said, test it. So they tested it with all these different aging methods, and it came back to be over 100 million years old. It was cow bone from 50 years ago. This is what we have to deal with. If we look at what God has designed, we know that it cannot be reduced to something that could have just come up by chance. There is a bacteria that has a flagellum on the end of it, and it's how it moves around. And it has all the parts that a boat motor would have. I mean, you can even see it, the gear that's in it that turns it, the rings that would hold it in place, everything. And it's how it moves about. There's no way that could have evolved over time, because all of the pieces of that boat motor would have had to come about at the same time. Would have had to have been some sort of massive mutation, as they say, and all 40 parts of that boat motor that he has that helps him to move around would have had to come about. The bombardier beetle is another idea that you can look at. The bombardier beetle has certain gases that are held within a chamber, in different chambers in its body. When it feels threatened, it will mix those gases together and spray them out at the intruder, at the predator, to burn them. If in fact the bombardier beetle had tried to evolve over a period of time, it would have exploded. The first one that would have evolved would have exploded, because it didn't have all those pieces that are needed in order for it to work. Or there is a woodpecker. You can imagine a woodpecker flying around. Woodpecker gets the idea. There must be bugs under the bark on that tree. So I'm going to fly down there, I'm going to land on that tree, and I'm going to get some of those bugs for dinner. So the woodpecker flies down, he lands on the tree, he falls off because he doesn't have any spurs on the back of his feet. So he flies back up and he flies around for 1 million years or so, thinking spur on the back of the feet thoughts, so that he can land on that tree and stay on it the next time he tries to land. And he's getting kind of hungry because, it's been a long time. So finally, through some sort of evolution, he forms the spurs on the back of his feet. And he flies down and he lands on the tree and he sticks to it because he's got the spurs now. And he pecks at the tree and immediately he dies, because he doesn't have the bone that's behind the nose, the beak of the woodpecker, that keeps the beak from breaking when he pecks into the wood. So his kids are flying around and say, oh, bummer, Dad's dead. So they fly around for another 500,000 years, thinking bone behind the beak thoughts. And they evolve to where they have the bone behind the beak. And they fly down, they've got the spurs, they land on the tree, they stick to it, they poke into that tree, and it's good because they've got the bone behind the beak now. But they can't get the bugs because they don't have the tongue of the woodpecker, which rolls up inside of its head, sort of like a sweat sock up in there. It's several feet long, all rolled up. They don't have that tongue to be able to reach out and get the bugs. You see, it's an endless idea. It's an endless problem for those that believe in evolution. How did this come about? How did that come about? It didn't come about by evolution. You're missing the whole point. God designed it that way. It obviously is designed for a specific purpose. Humans are designed for a specific purpose. We get into the book of Ecclesiastes. We find one of the world's wisest men trying to figure out what man's purpose is. And he said maybe it's whiskey. Maybe it's booze. So he tried that, and he found out wine was not the answer. And he said, well, maybe it's women. So he tried that, and that didn't work either. We know Solomon had more women than any other man. He said maybe it is knowledge. So he tried to gather all the knowledge that he could. And he found out that wasn't it either. Power, money, any of these things. All that he tried, he found that it was all, as he said, vanity. When it came right down to it, he did come to a conclusion at the end of a somewhat depressing book. But when you get to the end of it, in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, it says, let us hear the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commands, for this is the whole of man. See, he figured out what it was all about. That our purpose is to fear God, respect him, and keep his commands. We will not be complete until we've done those things. He gave us a way to salvation, the commands that we must keep in that too. After hearing and accepting the Word of God, to believe in Jesus as the Son, as the Messiah, and the only way to salvation of our sins, confessing him before others, and repenting of our sinful lives, and then being baptized for the remission of sins by full immersion in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. These are commands which he has given us in the New Testament as to how we are to become clean before God. And there are other commands after that we also follow because we love him. And that tells us that if we remain faithful to him unto death, that means even if you're going to die for remaining faithful, that we will receive a crown of righteousness. Maybe there's somebody here this evening who has not been baptized, who needs to become clean before him in the way that he has told us to follow those commands. Or maybe there's somebody here who has followed that set of commands, but has wandered away from the others that come after that, once we are Christians. If you have any reason to come forward and ask for help, won't you do so now as we stand and sing the invitation?